Welcome to the second presentation of an afternoon of degrowth and embracing weakness in the frame of Soft Solidarity Assembly. My name is Nana Heidenreich. I'll be moderating, but the main person is sitting here to my right, Marwa Arsanios, who's presenting today on, well, I'll first say a few words about her biography by way of introduction. She's a Berlin-based and yet strongly Beirut-linked artist, and especially in these times, I would probably say strongly linked, whose work, Who's Afraid of Ideology Part 3, Micro-Resistances, you might have just seen if you live in Berlin or visited Berlin at the Berlin Biennial at the KW. As many of her works, it is both research, video, in this case a video installation, and drawings. Part 3 points to the fact that this is an ongoing investigation. It began in 2017 of the struggles of women. She has interviewed, among others, members of the Kurdish Autonomous Women's Movement in Iraqi Kurdistan and Jinwar, a women-only commune in northern Syria. In many ways, her work is an investigation of the roots that connect today's various presents to history, and as such, she also works on the question of the archive. Today, I believe this archive might be connected to the ground beneath our feet, to soil and seeds. Radical politics is always the premise in her work, such as, for example, in her 2014 video, Have You Ever Killed a Bear?, on becoming Jamila, an inquiry into Jamila Bouhired, the Algerian freedom fighter, and the question what it means to become an icon. What does it mean to play a role, and what constitutes a subject? Today, she will be talking about the Female Farmers Women's Convention, which took place last year in June at the Warsaw Biennale. And she will ask questions around, or she will address questions such as, what does it mean to hold such an assembly within the frame of an art show? What are the possibilities of politics, radical politics, activism in such a framework? And what might be its limits? And I find this in particular very interesting because in some aspect that has been touched upon just by mere addressing practice in the presentation before by Vini Adamczak, and the question what art space allows for an investigation, and will be continued with the next presentation with Natasha Salra-Gigan, and maybe if we're lucky we have time for a joint conversation, but an art project, and it's organized by Galerie Wedding, and for us it's become both the common ground for political association, and yet we need to ask, what does that mean? So, for bringing some questions and some answers to this.
Thank you very much, Nana, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone here behind the camera, behind the scene. And thanks particularly for Ovul, who invited me to participate in this very promising assembly. So I think that the slides are on. Before going into one main project that I will talk about, and that is the Convention of Women Farmers and Ecological Feminists, that I co-organized in the framework of Warsaw Biennial in June 2019, I would like to give a bit of background on what kind of practices I'm coming from, or ones that were important for my learning, and what this entails in terms of building solidarity networks or aligned political stances that I have inherited and tried to put into space and practice together with many other people. So the case of the convention is an attempt to build an alliance, and many questions emerge when one is doing that from within art economy. Obviously, there is a lot of limitations, but I wouldn't want to fall into the trap of problematizing the art economy as something that is isolated from a general economy. Of course, it produces its specific set of problems in terms of ethics, aesthetics, and politics, but these problems and limitations go beyond it, and they are not only driven by it. So knowing that one is often acting and working in a group and a network of minds and hands and bodies, humans and non-human alike, and that labor is never the labor of one person, that of the artist, as art market and consequently art world structures would like it to be and would like to make believe. So we are always inherently embedded in a wider labor and thinking exchange relations, but it's often that market needs to extract one singular practice and put it under the spotlight as a brand and commodity, while forgetting and ignoring the social relations that made the work possible. And that is something maybe that is well known and seen by now, as this luxury item that is the artwork wouldn't exist as such if this erasure doesn't happen on the way. And I am emphasizing this in order to be able to answer some questions later when I finally talk about the promised convention. So let me first make a small step back into the late 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s and go back into my hometown in Beirut. A moment when we were trying to make space in the city and form ourselves into small cultural and artistic communities. We realized afterwards that they were necessary, these spaces that we were trying to forge, but also limited and fell into rather closed down circles slowly, detaching themselves from a certain locality, and thus avoiding a confrontation with a wider social sphere. The only possibility for making a feminist and or a queer spaces in the city lied in the act of retrieval or the retreat from the larger social sphere into a small community or organization of sorts. And this is perhaps because the confrontation was too difficult for many reasons that I won't have time to talk about now. So we functioned in an NGO economy of international funds that had on their agendas institutional buildings in the Middle East, strengthening the so-called civil society, often to counter more, Islamist agenda. So, and that, of course, came within its own discourses, political agendas, and a moment of globalization, whether in the arts or wider, but it meant that we were slowly, without really being aware of it, joining a global art world and detaching ourselves from a locality. So forging space came with a certain condition and a certain compromise of political discourses on the left, in order to make it more polite and more fully encompassing to different civil society fractions and position. So we found ourselves like centrist liberals, and people more on the left found themselves on the same side. This is, of course, a post-war moment for Beirut and a post-Cold War moment in the world, so it is not specific to Beirut. But it's not specific to Beirut, but it still has the particularity of the city. So as much as the ideological rifts were strong and ingrained, civil society was trying to erase that and somehow conceal it behind discourses of memory, collective memory and trauma and transitional justice, etc. So the left slowly migrated into the cultural field and slipped towards those such discourses. Perhaps this retreat from ambitious political projects was also a way to avoid the political paralysis and dispossession that we dealt with since 2 generations, and an obvious fear of another political failure. But it was also part of a new neoliberal economy, a fragmentation of struggles into small shops and different NGO organizations that would be internationally funded. Also wanting to follow the moment of small narratives and leaving behind the big heroic defeated narratives, we followed that track. So neoliberalization, fragmentation, and the only possibility that was there was to forge these small enclosed spaces and communities. And I'm not saying that was not necessary or useful, but retrospectively, we can see that it was a moment of depoliticization and part of the reconstruction project of the city and the dispossession, the fierce gentrification, etc. So the neoliberal bulldozer machine was at work very strongly, and erasure was happening on many different levels. The first encounter with political organizing in a wider sense outside of the cultural project happened through feminist organizations and movements. It was obvious to me then that the cultural project I was part of should step outside of its drawn limits of arts, culture, and para-academia. However, it was met with a certain established feminist discourse that was hegemonic in a way, as it was mostly promulgated through NGO institutions such as the liberal rights discourse and more identitarian discourses that were produced within this neoliberal economy. Of course, this was not a straightforward hegemony of one discourse over another. So it's, again, like this post-Cold War political subject is often built with a mix of different ideologies in conflict with each other. And so was our feminist political consciousness. But the question of class was obviously erased or put aside, or let's say bracketed. At some point, the small communal experiments ceased being the only possible parameters. This is when a new image and therefore new imagination came through. And it did come from the streets, and here I refer to the 2011 uprisings and the domino effect that has followed. Obviously, a system was collapsing, although it took 4 years after 2011 for this collapse to start revealing itself as such in Lebanon. Or maybe because the state there was already in a state of collapse, or has always been after the civil war. So it was about the mass movement that takes over the control of a place, a territory, a country, but without a progressive imagination, this could slip into a dystopic situation. But what comes out of it is a strongly organized feminist and queer movements, despite the different ideological struggle within them. So we started accepting political disappointments, the accumulation of political defeats were acknowledged, whether those inherited or directly experienced. We started seeing all of that as part of the building of the so-called desired social sphere. The trash crisis in 2015 shifted everything and put ecology at the center of the struggle, and it was a moment when I and together with many other people that were involved in feminist movements found very urgent to revisit legacies of ecological feminists. And here you see in the picture on the left the banner that says the patriarchal system kills, and it's a picture of the protests that were happening, this anti-trash crisis protests that were happening in 2015. And on the right side, this was what was actually how the trash was being treated and dumped on the shores and then reused to build land extension. So thrown into the sea as part of the material that would be used to build land extensions. So again, like valuable real estate. So this is where questions of organizing, alliance, and building space for solidary communal practices begin. As imperfect as they are, they respond to a neoliberal fragmentation of struggles and are born out of it as well. They are in a reaction to it, but also, wouldn't dismiss identitarian politics for that reason. So they try to think about several possibilities at the same time. So to imagine a new social sphere means also to enter into its fiction, the fiction of economics, politics, social arrangements, and agreements. It is a literary act in itself and the legal act of drafting a contract, a social one. An act of writing and an act of planning, which means also drawing. So perhaps with fiction, we can also add the aspect of science and the feminist tradition of utopian science fiction novels written by a world free of man, and the also lesbian separatist kind of imagination, or dystopic predictions about the future. So having both a science fiction projection and a socio-realistic one, we can perhaps imagine this feminist politics expanded into a wider social sphere. And perhaps here we talk about a kind of planetary form of alliance that includes human and non-human alike. But how? The drawing, planning, and construction of this image made out of soil, earth, and concrete appeared in the women-only commune of Jinwar on the border of Syria and Turkey on the Syrian side, and is part of the Kurdish autonomous women's movement reappropriation of state land and turning them into agricultural cooperatives and communes. It is a form of decommodification of land, a degridding and recoding, but seems closer to what a 20th century modernist utopia would be with a top-down architectural planning. However, the way it is organized is more egalitarian through small popular assemblies and in close alliance with the biosphere. It is a relation of close familiarity with the fauna and flora. That is one of the main pillars of this feminist experiment. That is one of the main pillars of this feminist experiment that was provoked by a survival necessity. So the process of building the new alliances come from an urgency to reimagine a certain reality one is forced to do, or because there is a power vacuum, like what you see here in this image or in this landscape, that allows one to recuperate land and redistribute it. So when the illusion of a solid space melts, something is one needs to take advantage of that moment, but at the same time one needs to be prepared. And if we zoom in a bit more into this proposal of living in alliance with the biosphere, one can also speculate on what can be built around the smallest entity or creature, such as the grain or a seed or a bacteria, as a counter-expansionist project. Or when the smallest grain becomes the essential thing around which an emancipatory vision is built. It stops being a human-made plan or a human-made projection only. So we start looking at possibilities inside the earth, inside the ground, or underground, rather than building the solid concrete space. We do another move and we dig for it. So in this act of digging for the possibility, we do not necessarily extract. Of course, this is kind of a little bit metaphoric and a little bit speculative, so just a way to imagine otherwise. We watch and we listen to small particles that move together in groups. So instead of the solid building, the digging, the attempting to listen to the underground. So that would be the move. And the reappropriation of territory could be done through these small creatures or with the help of these small creatures and entities in alliance with their labor. So how can one move from coding of land and the violence implicated in this process of coding that is constructed on extraction and abstraction through law, market, and the projection of value, and that shaped the individual subject as an owner and made this their most important status in the world? And it has led to a relationship with land that is mediated by a set of complex power relations. How can one move away from that by looking at how this is radically re-questioned when confronted with a set of relationships, knowledge, and politics coming from women that have always been defending and caring for land in non-extractivist and productionist manners? So a relationship of intimate knowledge and alliance, if one can say, with the communal lands, grounds, and soils. So how can one move towards a protocol of living with land that includes the non-visible creatures and entities that form an inherent element of the soil and its underground? This is what we were trying to think and draft together at the convention, a protocol of living, viewing, and listening to land while problematizing the economic structures behind some of the communes, farms, and cooperatives, which are often linked to the aid economy materialized on the ground by non-for-profit organizations. So the common ground between the different participating women in the convention was that they mostly come from movements and organizations that attempt to get rid of private property by reappropriating land in order to build cooperatives or communes, or form their own legislations in regards to the question of the land. Some of them are separatists from state structures under which they live. So the same decommodifying relation extends to the grains and the plants, seeds, etc. There is no accumulation process even with the seeds that are never conserved but constantly replanted, for example. So in a very old-fashioned internationalist solidarity or alliance building, the convention was trying to build that new common ground against a cross-class solidarity of the so-called nation building. And so rather thinking about it on a planetary scale. The only possible form of alliance would include non-human entities, land, biosphere, and animals. So when one thinks of the invisible creatures that live in the soil and underground, such as the bacterial, and understand their labor of maintenance to that ground as inherently part of any production labor, one immediately perceive them as allies in the structure that we create and the ground on which we stand. Of course, one of the main questions, to come back to the question of building such conventions and trying to build such alliances within an art economy, is how to continue such alliances. Obviously, the biennial format, and that was, it was the only possibility to do such a convention and bring together more than or around 20 women from all over the world, and have the translation and have all the support. But this is not a sustainable space for building alliance, and art economy in its precarity seems like not the very not the right space for this long-term work. So perhaps what it still gives is a space for thinking through different knowledges and expertise. But how, where, and in what form can we pursue such alliance is, one big question, especially at the moment. And also, like, all these women are already coming from movements or organizations that practice solidarity in different ways, and so it was great to learn from them, but how to continue that work. So I conclude now, and I would like to pose another maybe problem or a question to think about. And so for all the power and success of these different projects that were part of the convention, a crucial question must be asked. Do we fall back into a gendered division of labor where women are placed in the role of the caretakers again? So at a conference on decolonial practices held at the Académie der Kunst in the summer of 2018, Françoise Vergès pointed at that. And here I'm quoting her. So women are often put in the position of cleaning and caring for what is broken. There are 53 million domestic workers in the world who are cleaning the city for the middle and upper classes. We must think about waste and the production of waste as a capitalist mode of production. Women are now expected to clean and care for what has been broken in the earth, for the damage that has been done to the earth, to the land. But before rushing and doing the naturalized work of repair and care, let's take a moment to think about how it was broken, why and by whom. Who has inflicted the damage? Only then can the ecofeminist work of repair and growth begin to bear fruit. Thank you.
Thank you, Marwa. And thank you for that trajectory again, which is both, giving both yours, but also, again, highlighting why we ask certain questions here and now in a global, but in also local scale. I would like to pick up some of the trajectories because I thought it was really fascinating. So you started out by looking at these practices of trying to carve out space and therefore creating enclosures, and then moving on to melting the illusion of solid space, not just breaking down walls, but actually melting the illusion, to arriving at a different notion of underground, which I always like when we talk about the art sphere and, notions of underground and avant-garde. And so underground being something else here, and to protocols of living with land. And then again, arriving at a whole other idea of common ground. I'm recapitulating with what you told, because I think maybe we can come back to some of those instances of space in our conversation. But I would like to turn to what you ended with, to the question of time. I wrote down, what is the time of art? And I realized, when I introduced you, I would say, this work was done in 2014, this started and we all know that this, while within the frame of biennial, maybe there's, something is recuperated that was done maybe, now mid-20th century or even older. However, it's the idea of the new. And the duration is that of a year, or a biennial every other year. But it is not meant to continue. And we all know that it's sort of a phrase, it's been established as in global politics, in international politics, not in global, in international politics, the notion of sustainability. But I would like to return to this very question of time. And ask you what you think can be carved out in terms of the art economy in this larger frame. What kind of time? What is the time of art in the sense of this sort of creating a common ground?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's. I mean, I don't have anymore let's say the illusion that you can build something or have something on long term within an art economy. And I think this is, of course, because of the precarity of the whole economy, but also because of the interests and how interests shift. And they shift really very, very quickly. And how one is expected as an art worker or an artist, expected to shift interest with this kind of to always follow and to always bring something new, let's say. And I think that there is something in that mode of production that is not working actually anymore. And there is something that is completely, has reached a limit. Because obviously what we need is these longer term commitments and engagements. And perhaps that's not anymore the right space to do that. For example, when I started talking about the 90s and how there was a migration from people that were coming from the left to the cultural and art world, and I talk about that because I think that there was a move where there was a necessity to migrate back then. There was no other space that would allow such overlap of thinking other than that space, at least where I was, growing up. And I think that now it is an opposite move that needs to be done somehow, that there needs to be a migration again to another, outside maybe, or I mean, I don't want to go into this exit contemporary art, discussion, but I think that there needs to be a kind of another movement, because what is needed is another commitment and another form of engagement that this particular economy is not allowing anymore. So I think this is the and this is why I wanted to start with talking about this. The 90s and
this was very interesting to me because I have a similar trajectory. I mean, age-wise a little different, but where for me the shift to the cultural sphere of politics of the cultural sphere did not, in my mind, constitute an enclosure, but instead a shift or actually a widening of political practice from the known formats of demonstration, pamphlet, assembly, etc., to an understanding that the symbolic sphere, or sort of that needs to also be that you can do politics, that you do art not about politics, but you do politics with art, basically. Mm-hmm. And of course, we've reached a point where we need to ask that question again. But I was extremely grateful for that, bringing in a different trajectory to say that also has to do with the politics of shifting towards NGOism, of neoliberal reframing, and what that had to do with this carving out of spaces. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was important to reread that history, also to understand, I mean, anyway, for us, that's why I also introduced to saying that you dig deep in history always to understand something that is very urgent at the present moment. Mm-hmm. That might help, not in going back to something, but to say, okay, so that was a critical time in history. What is it now? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why I started with time was that if, when we talk about brokenness and extractivist and productionist economies, then of course we talk about climate crisis, or whatever wording we want to use for that. And that requires a very different way of thinking about time. Indeed, it would require to have an understanding of deep time, something I guess we can learn from people who write science fiction or fantasy novels or who hang out in gaming worlds. And but that alone doesn't seem to be pointing to that. Maybe that's a good idea. Since you brought in science and science fiction, maybe you can address a little bit the role of. We talked about concrete work by farmers, in this case the farmers that you brought together or helped bringing together in Warsaw last year. But what about science fiction? What about the speculative work of art in that sense? Art in a larger frame.
Yeah, maybe this is a good a place to start thinking about time in the sense of also like a projection into some possibilities in different time, and also to try to speculate on. Speculation can also be about speculating about a kind of a possibility of arts also, like itself, or an art structure or an art infrastructure, or what can this be or become and transform. And so it can also go in that direction. And perhaps the speculative side of art is still something that is for me the most still something that is like the drive, let's say. And but I'm also thinking, I think also about this question of that alone is not sufficient or something. So there needs to be like a juxtaposition of that with another proposal that is more, let's call it concrete, or but yeah, this is a question that I also often think about. But yeah,
I'm very much driven by this question: how to imagine otherwise.
Yeah.
And I feel like I have none of the tools for that, mind you. I'm not an artist, but also all I know is how to analyze, and it's always looking back, and it doesn't arrive at that moment, that moment of decision making. Also, that Bini was talking about, something that has to do with intuition and body and relation. But how to imagine otherwise, indeed, and I do think that is one of the reasons why that is also, art. Maybe not necessarily just the institutional field of art, but artistic practices in the larger sense.
Yeah. Maybe going back into the practices and thinking from as I was also like. Proposing in the presentation, to think from the perspective of the smallest entities and their like very tedious work, and the very tedious work that they do in the underground to certain soil, for example, or so go really dig there and listen to that. So maybe that's a some kind of poetic speculation that I'm thinking.
I think it's not just poetic, isn't the soil, like literally the layer of soil that we live on and off is decreasing. Yeah. I forgot what the terminology is, but I'll just say soil for now. I'm having a quick look. No, there's no. I don't see a question from the chat. I think we have time for one more question, and then we will be joined by Natasha Saragigan, and then hopefully pick up the discussion at the end. So you organized this convention, you organized it, and it was based on the research that you did in various places. And you said, well, the art economy, or it's not with continuity, but still the question is, did something sprout from this? Is there an element of continuity, because I mean, one of the things I learned is if you do create some kind of collective event, no matter how small or big, you can imagine all kinds of things, but you cannot and should not control what happens otherwise, because things can happen that are not done or followed up or organized by you. So did some seedling, something else happen from this that you didn't expect? Or?
Yeah. Yes, indeed. In fact, that there is most of the women are still in touch with each other, and this is something that is, and we still have this kind of group communication as well. And they have visited. Some of them have visited each other's cooperatives. So, for example, there was Maria from Chiapas that went to Merce's farm in south of Tolima. So there was a lot of links and exchanges that continued beyond the convention itself. And of course, these things continue, and they are as you said, beyond the moment of the convention and the control of it. But at the same time, I'm thinking that what did it actually bring in terms of structure, or how can one build a structure out of that could grow bigger and expand in some real solidarity network. But of course, there was a lot of also important exchanges, especially on the level of feminist discourses. So the women that were coming from Kurdistan, from the autonomous women's movement, they have a very strong feminist discourse that was very inspiring for women that were coming from Colombia, that had a different discourse, because of course the women from Kurdistan have been organizing for so long and really embedded in such intersection between questions of land and feminism, and so that this was also one of the, on a discursive level, it was also very fruitful in that way. And of course, all of these things happen, but maybe my question and my, let's say, discontent from, at the moment, because also we had a lot of time to think this year, and so I had a lot of time to reflect about that, and comes from the fact of questioning what structurally can be done otherwise. So
And now I think we're out of time, but so we don't end with this the notion of feminism just attached to the ground. Maybe next time we meet and discuss about solidarity around struggles, like trash struggles. As a concept, as a capitalist concept, but also as something, who's trash and who is trash. And anyway, that was actually, I was wondering if I know about the trash struggles and the trash sort of issues in Lebanon, but it's a global, we're living on a big trash pile. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's something we will come back on together and with more people. So thank you, Marwa.
Thank you, Nana. Yeah.
And thank you for making this possible for the audience who doesn't see how much work is going into this.